Hi, everyone. It's Joe Veneri, the host of Fit Insider, the show where I talk with the entrepreneurs, executives, and investors who are redefining the business of fitness and wellness. Today, I'm joined by Byron Ling of Canaan Partners. In this episode, we discuss Byron's investments in companies like Mir, Ro, Papa, and Uniform Teeth, his insights on building a consumer brand in the healthcare space, and what we should be on the lookout for as fitness, wellness, and healthcare converge. Let's get into it. Hi, Byron. Welcome to Fit Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Joe. Excited to be here.
Yeah, to kick things off and maybe just give the listeners some background, both about you and what you're working on at Canaan Partners.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a partner at Canaan. We're a venture capital firm that invests across multiple sectors from healthcare through technology. I focus mostly on consumer investing, which includes the sort of large world of fitness and wellness that I think we'll spend some time talking about. Canaan's been around for a little over 30 years, partnering almost always at the earliest stages with companies. So we typically partner with founders around the seed and Series A and Series B stage. And just real quick on my background, I've been investing about the last 5 years. I joined Canaan about 2 years ago. And prior to that, I was at a seed fund in New York called Primary, where I led a lot of early investments in companies like Mir and K Health. And prior to investing, I actually started on the operating side. I was an early employee at a company called Gilt Groupe in the e-commerce space that scaled really quickly for several years. So I've always kind of been in the New York ecosystem and consumer internet world. Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, a lot to dig in there. And I think a lot that will be of interest to listeners, both, operator focused, a variety of investments across health, healthcare, wellness, fitness. And maybe before we dig into that, you mentioned kind of investing at the earliest stage, but what are some of the criteria when you think about an investment, when you think about a team and maybe the check size that you're writing?
Sure. And yeah, so a lot of what we do is pretty early stage. So sometimes there's not even a product or there's very little traction. I think the areas that really stand out to us, team is really important. One of the areas that I particularly really think about is clarity of thought within a founder and sort of the clarity of their vision. We think that clarity of thought enables really critical focus early on, and it's so important when you're trying to find product market fit. The other area that I do spend a lot of time thinking about is market structure. And so while, of course, we like large markets, we also like markets that are well positioned for a new entrant and a new founder to attack. And so we think about those two domains in particular. And I think from a personal level, one of the things that I've gravitated towards over the years is also founders that are just really great at learning, and they're just constantly learning, really adaptable. We just think that's such a competitive advantage in the earliest stages.
Yeah. And, I definitely agree there, both around the founders and also identifying maybe those tailwinds in the sectors that are ripe for disruption. As you think about maybe evaluating teams and founders, how are folks getting on your radar, and what does that sourcing deals and maybe deal flow look like on your end?
Yeah, sourcing's it's a little bit like marketing, where you kind of always have a variety of different channels. And I'm a big believer that great opportunities can come from anywhere. Some of the investments that I've been fortunate to invest have come through really serendipitous channels. So, outside of normal early stage investors that send us deal flow, I actually spent a lot of time thinking about different markets and different approaches into markets. And so very commonly, I'll also reach out to founders through a cold email. And so we don't really discriminate too much on how you get in touch with us. I think the things we like to see, to reiterate, are that level and clarity of thought and just a really unique view on what your product is and why it's differentiated. And to your point, why is the time right now versus in 10 years versus 10 years ago? I think when we kind of hear those things early on in a story, it gets us really excited. And the reality is those opportunities can come from anywhere.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, the investments that you've made speak to so many of those things, whether it's maybe a clarity of thought, seeing something in a market that's ripe for disruption. Maybe it's not, how big is this right now, but how big can it be? Is this the right time to get involved? So a few of those things include Papa, which is targeting kind of the senior care space, Row, Bravo Sierra, Euphorics, Mirror, a variety of things across a broad definition of health and wellness. Maybe can you pick a couple of those and talk about what you saw in the opportunity, how you got initially involved, and maybe where they are today?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about Mirror first, which I made at my prior fund as an early investment. I'd met Bryn, the founder and CEO, ironically through a person who was not an investor at another venture firm. And so it just goes to show really good opportunities and teams can come from anywhere. A lot of what got us excited about Mirror was I'd spent a lot of time studying the history of fitness in this country and looking back more than a couple decades, going back to World War II, and then sort of tracing a bit of the evolution through the rise of boutique fitness companies like SoulCycle in 2005 and 2006, and then really taking a look at Peloton as it was quite early in its adoption. And what we liked about Mirror, in addition to Bryn's expertise in the space, was she had a really clear point of view that while Peloton was perhaps really serving individuals who wanted to spin, there was a whole other category and plethora of categories and genres of fitness content that weren't spinning. And, she had this ambition to create both the hardware and the software and content behind that, that I think we just sort of fell in love with. And so for us, there was definitely an element of the timing of consumers wanting in-home fitness solutions that were high quality. And so through the combination of both timing and conviction on Bryn, we were really lucky that she partnered with us in the earliest stages. Another example of a company we invested in at Canaan is a company called Uniform Teeth, which in its simplest form is sort of building one medical for orthodontics through technology. And a lot of our interest in this category was there was tremendous amount of growth in young adults and seniors and even teenagers in pursuing clear aligner therapy for both cosmetic and healthcare reasons. And what we liked about Megan, who's the co-founder and CEO of Uniform Teeth, was they had built an entirely new software stack that was vertically integrating the entire experience. And this is quite similar to businesses like One Medical and Oak Street Health, which is doing something similar in the Medicare Advantage space. And so we got a tremendous amount of conviction because the market structure of that industry was ripe for disruption, and they had built just an incredibly modern experience that was technology enabled, it was clinically credible, and it was most importantly affordable compared to the options on the market. So that's an example of a business that crosses both consumer wellness and healthcare elements, and certainly has at the intersection of engineering and clinical outcomes.
Yeah, we're seeing that so much more, whether that's in the telemedicine space, with dentistry, with some of the insurance products. They have the kind of consumer appeal, brand, even acquisition channels, but vertically integrating it, doing some really interesting things on the technology side that put them, far differentiated from kind of the incumbents, maybe a little bit more old school. How do you think that plays out when you look at, obviously you're invested in Row, but there's Hims who recently went public, and the competition there, when you have someone who's taking this kind of direct to consumer approach to healthcare, telemedicine, with the market being so big, does it even matter in terms of competition, or is it really drilling into some of the details and them being very differentiated when you kind of look under the hood?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it does start a little bit with, what is our view on the market? And so, orthodontics, as an example, is largely cash pay. And so our view was, if you created a differentiated treatment plan product and had an amazing experience, the market could keep growing because you're taking what used to be a $6,000 product and turning it into $2,000. In the case of a business like Row, a lot of it depends more on the approach and the strategy. And I think one of the things we were really drawn to, in addition to the quality of Zach and his team, was their vision was much larger than just being in the cash pay market in a lot of the product categories that they were in initially. And their vision was really building greater technology that could bridge primary care and non-chronic condition care to the masses. And so a good example of that is they recently partnered with a company called Plenity, which is actually one of the first FDA-approved weight loss drugs. And so, we think that partnership, which is exclusive to Roe, is a great testament to the software, but also just clinical buy-in from the pharmaceutical world. Roe will be the first company to deliver that product exclusively direct to consumer to the masses. And so I think it really depends a bit more on the approach in the end market. But we do look for that ability to take or create more proprietary streams of revenue at some point.
Yeah, I see that also as being something that's really differentiated. It was interesting when, that product launch, for example, really kind of separates it because so much you can see the lines between wellness and healthcare blurring. And it's, is this, are we going to turn around and put out a quote unquote like supplement that's maybe unproven, or is this we're going to stick to putting out, in this case, an FDA approved product that has been validated and can use these distribution channels to get out into the world. In your mind, as you're looking at different opportunities, and whether that's specific companies or just like categories in general that may be of interest to you, how do you think about the difference between healthcare and wellness, and where the lines are, and almost when is it important and when is it not?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think about this a lot because we see the term wellness and healthcare get kind of thrown together a bunch. One of the great things about Canaan is about a third of our team is dedicated on healthcare. And so I'm really fortunate that when I look at some of these businesses, I can bring a lot of the expertise around the growth and the consumer aspects, but we can also bring to bear a really strong healthcare team who's been investing in therapeutics and diagnostics and biotech for over 30 years. So we really like that synergy, and I've been very fortunate to have that here. And to answer your question directly, it really just depends on what is the desired outcome. And when there's a clinical view on what a high quality outcome is, we think a lot about what does the business model allow around that. And so, a good example to kind of segment is a company like Uniform Teeth. They're not removing the orthodontist or dentist from the experience. And the reason is there's something called standard of care, which is an all caps expression in healthcare, which is if you're going to treat someone in a healthcare experience, there's standards that the government sets around what you need to have done in advance. You need to be screened by a licensed professional. And so in categories like this, where it's very clear in our view, clinicians aren't going away, but the opportunity is to bring better technology to them. We screen a lot for the teams that really understand that. And the reality is we see a lot of teams that don't follow that. And we tend to find that those aren't the best partnerships for us. On the wellness side, in areas that touch food and beverage or even areas of fitness, it's a little more fluid, I think, to be honest. And a lot of what we spend time is understanding the rules and regulations around how a product is classified by the government and the FDA. But we mostly think about it from an audience and end market perspective while thinking about the regulatory landscape as well.
Was the thought process, and that makes a lot of sense just given the structure of Canaan, but was the thought process at the firm like, hey, there is this overlap, and thus we want to have kind of the expertise split across these two kind of different categories where you do kind of typically see funds break out into, we're consumer/tech focused. On the flip side, we are exclusively healthcare focused. Was that the intention, or is that how it evolved over time?
It's actually been that way since the beginning. And you're right, over the last kind of 20 years, some firms have taken different approaches where they've split them out. And for us, we've found it's a great structure for both entrepreneurs and LPs. And specifically for me, to be selfish for a second, the types of conversations we can have with teams where we can balance many of the elements that have consumer internet properties, but also have a conversation around what it's like selling into Medicare Advantage plans. And so the combination has been really additive for us. And we think a lot of companies, Pop is a great example where there's a consumer marketplace element, matching gig economy workers with elder care individuals. but there's also a tremendous amount of healthcare payer interaction given their business model. So it's been a really positive structure for us, and we think in some ways an advantage as we spend time with teams that are operating at this intersection.
Yeah, absolutely. Just from the outside looking in, would have to agree, because sometimes you do have that, you talk back to what you look for in a founder. They have maybe that kind of domain expertise, the clarity of thought around a particular problem and or market, but they might not know how to go about selling this into a health insurance or Medicare, Medicaid, whatever it might be. They might not know how to market it through acquisition channels that exist today, where someone like you who's an operator comes from that background. You're like, well, we can take care of that part of it and kind of help steer you one way or the other. But certainly giving those founders a leg up on the competition maybe when it comes to those insights.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the larger trends that's been going on, and you've seen this in the enterprise with a lot of the productivity tools, but it is the broad consumerization of healthcare. And that's not just direct consumer products like a Row or Uniform Teeth, but it's also consumerization of the tools that are used in the healthcare system. And so Papa fits that as well. And so, yeah, we think a lot about, when I spend time, or I should say we spend time with companies, it's often myself and one of my partners from the healthcare team. And so we think we make better decisions in that way, but we also think we can help teams more effectively as well.
Yeah. And so as you're thinking about, even some of the investments that we talked about so far, telemedicine, senior care, non-alcoholic drinks, at-home fitness, as you start to go down the list of these things are going more direct to consumer, is there a category, maybe white space you're looking at now, an opportunity that's untapped that maybe you're excited about?
Yeah, I would say it's still largely untapped, and it's mental health. And there's a lot of great founders working on this problem today. And I think one of the really large overarching challenges is it's still stigmatized as a choice. And so there's a really big dislocation between content, education, and just accessible solutions in the category. And so, one of the things we spent a lot of time thinking about is what are some of the permanent shifts out of COVID. We've seen a tremendous number of mental health virtual care platforms that have taken off. And that shouldn't be a surprise, as, I think COVID has been really challenging on a lot of people globally. So we haven't made a bet in the space yet, but we actively spent a lot of time looking and meeting a lot of great teams that are working on solving this.
Sure. Have you, to this point, both around mental health and, that being kind of accelerated by COVID, people now being willing to, forced to in many situations, try remote care or seek out care online beyond, and kind of to your point, just them making that initial engagement. There's you've taken the step to do it. And then it's almost like at this point, what comes after that? What is the thing that is differentiating the various platforms in terms of treatment? I've actually had Alex Katz from Two Chairs on the show, and they do a lot about matching the therapist with the patient. And so there's different things that can stand out, but is there something that in your mind you're saying, how do we, once we've made that initial connection, make this like a care path that we can elicit results over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we see a couple different strategies. And sometimes it's a little bit more direct to consumer, where the company's building their brand and they're doing everything from the matching to the actual, maybe the underlying technology that facilitates care, as well as prescriptions. And then I think there's a bit more of the kind of B2B Shopify-esque approach, where we're building great tools for therapists, and the therapists are our customers. And there's some parallels to maybe Cam's business of what he's working on. And we're not as much in the business of trying to acquire demand for you. We're just trying to build, the Shopify equivalent of mental care, whether it's virtual or in person. I think one of the things that is really important in this category is, at least in our view, is at some point to really scale, you're going to need to be in network with some of the large health plans in this country, and of which there's only a couple. And so one of the things we think that's going to be critical is what are sort of the outcomes that you can show through the clinical literature that you've been using or the therapist profile that you've been using. And so that's something that I think is still just early, to be honest. Most of these companies are still less than 2 to 3 years old. And I think many of them are just starting to have some of those in-network conversations. But we think that's going to be a critical part at some point because the payers are going to be involved to become quite large.
Sure, yeah, and definitely early with so many of these different categories. I wanted to circle back to fitness, and you mentioned M.B.A. and really kind of digging into the fitness category and maybe some of the history behind it. Looking at that and maybe looking at what has happened since that investment in M.B.A. Obviously, they sold to Lululemon. There was a $500 million acquisition there. Now M.B.A. is on pace to do, last number I saw was $150 million in revenue this year, which is certainly accelerated by COVID. Was there anything in the evolution of that space in the time since maybe you've invested in along that M.B.A. acquisition that has surprised you? And is there anything that you're kind of seeing as maybe what comes next when now you look at all the companies, whether that's Peloton to Tonal to Hydro, who are in that space as well?
Yeah, it's been interesting how many new players they've been, and you've done a great job keeping the world and certainly myself educated on the number of companies. And we've been very fortunate, even since I transitioned to Canaan, to take a look at some of the newer entrants. I mean, I think one of the takeaways for me when I really dug into the fitness landscape, when we kind of look over the last couple of years and where we are now is really the different audience segments and who's really well served and who isn't. And so I think it's great for consumers that there are so many more kind of hardware, software enabled solutions coming to market that sort of tap in these different genres, whether it's erg or strength or boxing. I think one of the considerations I do think about is, what is really the audience size of people that are going to have that many devices at home? And just really how retentive are those solutions in the long run, and what role does the hardware play, not just in the next couple of years, but 5 or 10 years out. I think one of the most interesting trends to me, which I think is slightly different than some of the companies you mentioned, is actually the overall fitness market is growing. And by that, I mean, there are more people getting a gym membership for the first time than ever before. And this is probably disrupted slightly with COVID, but that was certainly quite true over the last couple of years. And so what I think a lot about going forward is that I think Peloton and M.B.A. are going to be great. It's not clear to me how many of those companies will exist at scale. But I think what's great about the overall market growing is there's so many new audiences that really there's a white space of solutions, right? So think about families with little kids or elders, older seniors, which is an area I spent a lot of time in thinking about. A lot of the existing solutions today just aren't positioned toward those audiences. And so I think that's going to be one area of opportunity for sure. And I'm really excited to see, it's less almost about the brand, it's more about the impact, right? So if you can create better solutions for people in their 70s to improve their lives, like, boy, I can just tell you that has a real impact, not just in terms of quality of life, but also costs on the healthcare system. And it's something we think a lot about at Papa. And then the other area that I think is interesting is really, is there a white space of tools to democratize all the talent out there? The reality is not everyone can afford a Peloton. And so I think there's still a white space of solutions that are personalized, high quality, and really accessible in the landscape.
Right. That's the exciting part. Sometimes I also, as we're looking at this space and cover it so closely, I almost get down on all of the connected equipment, the piece where it's just like spending that much money for the average person who has no exercise routine, habit, like is not going to make that investment of time and or money. How does that end up impacting the obesity epidemic, right? And when you start to think about if it just brings awareness to the idea of exercise in the same way that these various direct-to-consumer healthcare and mental health platforms and apps, whether that's on the spectrum from meditation to actual like clinical mental health care, it's just creating more opportunity for more people. And hopefully as we see more money from, investors flow to that space, as we see founders who are stepping in to create solutions for the senior care market, whether that's, around loneliness and companionship, or whether that's around physical activity or exercise, whether that's around mental health. I think in the long run, we'll start to see the benefits of that, but this being the very early days. So hopeful, but also like conflicted sometimes.
Yeah. And I think it's not to say any of these companies that have been successful are going away. I think in many ways, the scale and in some ways the value that's been created kind of paves the foundation for, oh boy, what could happen if we could create a really engaging product for older people or, families with young kids to do together. But yeah, and I think this goes back to kind of our earlier point around, wellness and healthcare are really all encompassing. And, we try to take a pretty holistic view at everything, not just, fitness. And so I'll give you a good example, which is really a learning for me from Papa, which is sold through large healthcare plans. Just getting someone who's in their 70s to go on a walk 20 minutes, 2 to 3 times a week, directionally can have a huge impact on their care later in life, whether it's delaying chronic conditions, mental health, which is another area within senior cares we haven't spoken about. And so it's small things like that where, that's not, probably Peloton's not going to solve that, but it has the potential for huge impact. And so we think there's a lot of opportunity, but maybe in a more accessible format going forward.
Sure. And you might have a unique perspective on this, just given both the healthcare and the consumer, also more kind of like fitness focused interests. Is there, or maybe why isn't there, the pursuit to vertically integrate some of these things even more? When you talk about somebody's health and well-being comprehensively, it is physical activity, it is nutrition, it is mental health. And whether that's involvement from the healthcare industry or whether that's somebody coming in and saying, hey, let's roll this up into like a really comprehensive offering. Is that something you think we'll see, or is it just too complicated and way too many moving parts for like any one company to take on?
So that's a really great question. And I think one of the inherent challenges is just the way healthcare is structured in this country. And I think that creates some challenges because the teams that create exceptional consumer products, they may not necessarily know or care to position that as part of the incentive structure of health plans. And so, but wouldn't it be great if, someone well before they're potentially diabetic could get a Mirror or Peloton, right? And have much greater alignment of incentives. I think we're in the early stages of it, to be honest. I think maybe from the fitness side, we've seen some B2B solutions that would try to position that same benefit to self-insured employers. I think part of it is that the DNA is just at odds. I mean, to really work with healthcare plans is a very specific DNA. Again, that doesn't mean it can't happen. I mean, I think I remain optimistic, and part of the thinking on more accessible products is that maybe you don't need the health plans involved early on, but you can at least get broad distribution and start to figure out how can we have an impact on a more mass audience.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that, one thing that kind of popped into my mind, we've scratched the surface of it on the newsletter and maybe gotten into it in a couple of different podcasts, but just where somebody like Amazon sits in that, where somebody like Apple sits, obviously they have the Apple Watch, they've done a lot around HealthKit, and them being somebody who can start to, roll up or integrate some of these different offerings. Have you put thought to, where some of these technology companies sit in the healthcare ecosystem, and maybe as a part of that, like what role wearables play or don't play?
Yeah, I think it's what's really clear is, these are all several $1 trillion market cap companies. And so it says a lot about the opportunity in healthcare when they're starting to focus on it, especially for themselves and their employees alone. And so I think it's really clear over the next decade, we'll see their ambitions sort of play out. On the wearables point, I think it's still early in my view. And I think part of it is, it's unclear today if the current set of wearables on the market has truly actionable data as it relates to a healthcare plan. But that doesn't mean it couldn't evolve really quickly in the next couple of years. To be honest, I don't really have a great response here. I actually think they're still operating more in the sort of consumer health and wellness mindset as opposed to the true healthcare system today. I think they're really interesting companies. I was very fortunate to invest in a company called K Health, which is still a startup, but I would say later stage now, that has sort of built, the best way to think about it is using machine learning to recreate the primary care doctor and diagnosis experience. And so I think a lot of that innovation between the consumer world and the healthcare companies is probably still going to come from the startups until we see something otherwise.
Sure. And I think, much of what we talked about today, a lot of the trends accelerated by COVID and really no way to make a prediction on them. So we kind of have to let it play out with the knowledge that, personal well-being, the role of technology in that is larger than ever before and happening much faster than maybe even we thought that it already was accelerating. So we'll be interesting to see, as we get into the end of the year and then, going forward in 2021. But as we come up on time here and look to wrap up, just want to say, what is the best way for folks to get in touch? Where can they find you on the internet if they were interested in connecting?
Yeah, so active on Twitter and Medium, always available and open to, a great cold email. I really just all over the place, to be honest.
Yeah, it won't be hard to find you, and we'll make sure it's easy with the links and the show notes and everything else. But Byron, it was a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks so much, Joe. I had a great time.
Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode. For more from Fit Insider, visit insider.fit.co and subscribe to our weekly newsletter for insights and analysis on the business of fitness and wellness. Then go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. See you next time.